Maplewood, known for its winding streets and quiet ambience, had always held a certain charm, particularly in autumn when the trees shed their fiery leaves, blanketing the town in colors of rust and gold. In this small town, Halloween wasn't just a day, it was an event. And no one took it more seriously than Mrs. Evelyn Carter. Every October, her house on Willow Lane transformed into a spectacle, a place of eerie elegance, with cobweb-laced chandeliers and pumpkins carved with unnerving precision. This year was different, though, as her daughter Helen, now 14, had insisted on inviting a few school friends. "Let them see how grand it is, Mom," she had pleaded, her enthusiasm cutting through Mrs. Carter's usual decorum. Mrs. Carter, who found joy in the control of such gatherings, had reluctantly agreed, though she couldn't shake an unsettled feeling that the addition of Helen's friends might disrupt the harmony of her carefully crafted Halloween. As twilight cast long shadows across the town, guests began arriving at the Carter house, drawn to its warm orange glow. Mrs. Carter, dressed in a deep plum dress, greeted each of them with a precise smile. Her pale face, framed by tightly pinned curls, was still, her eyes calm, yet somehow too watchful. She extended delicate hands to old friends, exchanging pleasantries and making them promise to try her freshly baked pumpkin bread. Helen watched as her friends entered, all laughing, a bundle of barely contained energy. They wandered through the house, whispering excitedly about the decorations, a towering scarecrow by the fireplace, flickering lanterns placed at every corner, and the soft, ghostly melodies that seemed to drift through the air. They marveled at the meticulous details, unaware that their admiration might be tinged with something more. But as the evening progressed, an odd tension settled in the room. Mrs. Carter moved among the guests, straightening decorations, correcting any misplaced finger foods, adjusting costumes with a gentle but firm touch. Her eyes often found Helen's friends, scrutinizing them as they whispered amongst themselves, laughing nervously, perhaps sensing something unusual. Mrs. Carter's expressions became increasingly intense, her gaze lingering just a little too long. Helen noticed her friend's discomfort. "Mom," she said, attempting a cheerful tone, "maybe you could help with the music?" She gestured toward the outdated record player in the corner, hoping it would give her mother something else to focus on. But Mrs. Carter only nodded absently, turning instead to a group of adults gathered near the dining room, offering them her delicate, tight-lipped smile. As Helen's friends continued to exchange glances, she felt a twinge of embarrassment, mixed with something harder to place. The house that had always felt warm and safe now seemed shadowed by something uncanny, the air thick and still. She watched her mother as she floated through the guests, her steps calculated, her gaze sharp. One of Helen's friends, Aaron, tugged on her sleeve, pulling her aside. "Helen, your mom, she keeps watching us. Is she always like this?" Helen laughed it off, though it sounded hollow even to her own ears. "It's just Halloween. She wants everything to be perfect, that's all." But as the laughter around them grew quieter and Mrs. Carter's fixed smile tightened, Helen couldn't shake the creeping unease settling in her bones. The music drifted faintly from the old record player, crackling with age as an eerie melody filled the room. Shadows flickered along the walls, given life by the warm, uneven light of jack-o'-lanterns perched on shelves and mantels, their carved faces twisting and sneering in the dim glow. The guests mingled, though there was a noticeable quiet to the festivities, a silence punctuated by low murmurs and half-hearted laughter that seemed to echo in the cavernous, candle-lit room. Helen's friends moved in a loose circle around her, huddled and whispering, their eyes darting over their shoulders now and then to where Mrs. Carter stood by the dining room, watching them. It was as if they were drawn to the safety of numbers, their voices falling to murmurs as they took in the surroundings with wide, uncertain eyes. Aaron nudged Helen again, whispering just loud enough for her to hear, "She's been watching us all night." Doesn't she, look kind of strange tonight?" Helen glanced at her mother, who was smoothing an imaginary crease on the corner of a tablecloth, her movements precise, her fingers lingering on each corner as though the entire night rested on their perfect alignment. Helen had always known her mother to be particular, to find pride in details that others might overlook. But tonight, there was something almost feverish in her gestures, a hint of impatience in the way her hands swept over the decorations, her face tightening whenever one of the guests moved an object even slightly out of place. "It's just Halloween, Helen muttered, her voice wavering. She felt her cheeks grow hot, though she couldn't say why. "Mom gets like this every year. She likes everything to look a certain way." Across the room, Mrs. Carter's eyes met Helen's, and Helen felt her heart skip. There was a strange intensity in her mother's gaze, a look she couldn't recall seeing before. It was a look of control, of determination, as if Helen and her friends were part of a larger plan, pieces in a tableau that Mrs. Carter needed to arrange, just so. Suddenly, Mrs. Carter clapped her hands, her voice carrying across the room with a measured calm. "I think it's time we all gather in the living room," she announced, gesturing toward the seating area where cushions and blankets had been arranged in a circle. "It's time for a little Halloween tradition. A story." There was a murmur of approval from the adults, who moved toward the couches and armchairs with relaxed familiarity. Helen's friends, however, exchanged wary looks, casting sidelong glances at each other, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Helen felt her pulse quicken as she led them forward, taking a seat on one of the plump cushions, the thick carpet brushing against her legs. Once everyone was seated, Mrs. Carter dimmed the lights, leaving only the faint glow of the pumpkins and candles to cast eerie shadows around them. She stood before the group, her face barely visible in the half-light, her eyes glittering with an odd excitement. "Tonight," she began, her voice smooth and measured, "I want to tell you all a story about the history of Maplewood. After all, Halloween is about facing the things that scare us, isn't it?" Her words hung in the air, lingering like smoke, and Helen felt a shiver race down her spine. She glanced at her friends, who shifted uncomfortably, their faces tinged with apprehension. Mrs. Carter smiled then, a small, tight smile, and continued, her voice lowering as though sharing a secret. "There was once a woman who lived in Maplewood, many years ago, who was known for her love of Halloween," Mrs. Carter said, her voice soft yet unwavering. She would host the most lavish gatherings, year after year, inviting everyone in town to join her in her grand, old home. But over time, people started to notice strange things. Helen's friends leaned in, drawn to spite themselves, their expressions a mixture of intrigue and unease. Mrs. Carter's eyes glittered as she went on, her voice barely a whisper now, compelling and magnetic. "Guests would feel watched, even when alone," she said, glancing around the room. "Doors would close on their own, locking people inside. And once you were there, she would insist that you stay, because, you see, she believed that Halloween was a night to keep people close, to hold them in her home." The silence was thick, each word sinking into the room as the flickering candlelight cast warped shadows against the walls. Helen felt her breath catch, her pulse a soft, rapid beat beneath her skin. Her friends looked to her, their expressions pale, as if questioning how well she really knew her own mother. Mrs. Carter's gaze swept over them all, lingering on Helen for a brief, chilling moment. She let her words fade, that smile returning to her face, a smile that, in the dim light, seemed less human and more like the carved faces of the pumpkins surrounding them. "After all," she murmured, almost to herself, "sometimes it's better not to let the night end." The silence that followed was almost tangible, a thick pause punctuated only by the soft hiss of the record player and the occasional crackle of the candles. Helen's friends shifted, their unease unmistakable, and even the adults seemed subtly unsettled, as though Mrs. Carter's story had drifted a little too close to something dark lurking beneath the cheerful decorations. Helen caught her mother's eye and tried to smile, but there was a strange look in Mrs. Carter's gaze, something sharp and purposeful that made her daughter's heart skip. It was as if, for the first time, Helen was seeing her mother through a different lens, seeing her not as a mother, but as someone else entirely, someone unknown and unyielding. Aaron leaned close to Helen, whispering, "I don't like this. Your mom's, she's acting kind of intense." Helen swallowed, trying to dismiss the prickling feeling rising in her chest. She loves Halloween, that's all." But even as she said it, Helen wasn't sure she believed it. Her mother had always been particular about these things, order, decorum, every detail in place, but tonight, her behavior felt less like pride and more like something ominous. Mrs. Carter broke the stillness with a bright smile, the kind she often gave when entertaining guests, though this one seemed stretched too tightly. "Now," she announced, clasping her hands, "I thought we might play a little game. It is Halloween, after all. Let's see who among us has the most daring spirit." The teenagers exchanged uneasy glances, and Helen felt a pang of embarrassment mingling with her worry. She could see her friends shifting, nervously glancing at the door, and she silently willed her mother to stop, to release her tight grip on this strange performance she seemed to be putting on. "Here's how it works," Mrs. Carter continued, her tone light but somehow not comforting. "I'll give each of you a challenge. A simple test of courage. Nothing more." She gestured to the darkened hallway that stretched from the living room toward the back of the house. A small walk in the dark, a few minutes of silence, nothing to be afraid of. There was a strange hush as she spoke, a gravity to her words that seemed to settle on each person like a weight. Helen watched her mother's face, noting the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, the flicker of excitement in her eyes. She looked as though she were barely holding something back, as though something hidden beneath her polished exterior were beginning to show through. "Wouldn't it be easier if we just hung out here?" asked Chris, one of Helen's friends, his voice cracking slightly. "Like, maybe we could play a regular game or something?" Mrs. Carter's smile faltered only for a second, but that was enough to make Helen's breath catch. "Oh, Chris," she said softly, almost pityingly, "you're not afraid of the dark, are you? Surely, there's nothing more thrilling than a little adventure." Her eyes seemed to fix on him, their intensity unsettling. After all, Halloween is the night when spirits linger, when shadows move, when we get to face what scares us most. Helen tried to read her mother's expression, but it was as though Mrs. Carter had slipped into some other role, as though she were caught up in a game of her own making, with rules that only she understood. She moved closer to Helen and her friends, her presence oddly looming, even as she kept her tone light and coaxing. "Aaron," she said, turning her gaze to the friend closest to Helen, "why don't you start? Just a small walk down the hallway and back. You'll see, there's nothing to it. Just a bit of fun." Aaron hesitated, glancing at Helen with wide eyes, but Helen could only nod encouragingly, feeling a strange loyalty to her mother, as though excusing her behavior might help ease the tension. Aaron gave a nervous smile, stood up, and made her way to the hallway. Helen and the others watched as Aaron's figure receded into the darkness, her footsteps fading, leaving only the silence and the flickering shadows. The seconds ticked by, stretching into a taut silence. Helen waited, her heart pounding harder with each passing moment. And then, finally, the sound of footsteps returned, slow and hesitant. Aaron emerged from the darkness, her face pale, her eyes wide, but she managed a small, brave smile as she rejoined the circle. "It's nothing," Aaron said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Just dark." Mrs. Carter's smile deepened, and for a moment, Helen thought she saw something else in her mother's eyes, a glimmer of satisfaction, as though some secret plan had fallen into place. Helen felt a chill run through her, a sensation as if something had clicked into focus, something she couldn't quite name. "Well done, Aaron," Mrs. Carter said, her voice rich with praise. "See? Nothing to be afraid of. Just a bit of darkness. Now," she turned her gaze back to the others, "who's next?" Her tone was almost playful, but the room's atmosphere had turned thick with apprehension. As each friend took their turn, one by one, Helen noticed the same thing, her mother watching them with an intensity that bordered on unsettling, her satisfaction growing with each reluctant participant. And all the while, the feeling in Helen's chest grew heavier, a mixture of worry and dread that she couldn't shake, as though some unseen presence lingered just beyond the flickering light, watching her too. Finally, it was Helen's turn. She stood, her legs unsteady, and glanced back at her friends, who watched her with silent expressions of support tinged with fear. Her mother's eyes followed her every step as she crossed to the edge of the hallway, where darkness swallowed her whole. As Helen walked, the shadows seemed to close in, the silence stretching unnaturally around her. She could feel her mother's eyes on her even from the distance, an unshakable presence that filled the dim corridor with something sharp, almost malicious. And then, just as she reached the end of the hallway, Helen heard it, a faint whisper, almost too soft to discern. A single word, spoken in the hush, reverberating in the darkness. "Helen." She froze, her heart hammering. She was alone, but that voice, familiar and foreign all at once, lingered in the air, hanging like a ghost. She waited, listening, straining her ears. And then, the voice came again, clearer, and this time, it was unmistakably her mother's. "It's only just begun." Helen's breath quickened as she emerged from the dark hallway, the familiar comfort of the brightly lit room doing little to shake the tremor that had settled deep within her bones. Her friends greeted her return with nervous smiles, each one carrying the same wide-eyed expression that mirrored her own. It was as if they, too, sensed the evening slipping into something unfamiliar, something darkly unnameable. But Mrs. Carter welcomed her back into the circle with an almost giddy satisfaction, her eyes gleaming. She gestured for Helen to sit, and Helen, half-dazed, lowered herself onto the edge of the sofa. Her friends looked to her for some reassurance, but she had none to give. Instead, she glanced down, avoiding her mother's piercing gaze. "That was wonderful, Helen," Mrs. Carter murmured with a strange fondness, her voice rich with pride. "I knew you wouldn't let me down." The room fell silent, and the shadows cast by the flickering candles seemed to grow longer, shifting and settling over them like a blanket. The guests fidgeted, the flickers of unease barely concealed beneath polite smiles and murmured chatter. But Mrs. Carter's attention remained fixed on Helen, her intense gaze causing her daughter to feel as though she were under a magnifying glass, each movement, each expression dissected and examined. An hour passed, then another, and as the clock struck midnight, Mrs. Carter's behavior only grew more peculiar. She began pacing the edges of the room, her fingers trailing along the walls, almost caressing them as she moved. Her face held a trance-like focus, her eyes drifting to the windows, the doors, the crevices where shadows hid. She muttered softly to herself, the words barely audible, as if reciting some private litany. Helen's friends, already on edge, exchanged anxious glances. Erin finally worked up the nerve to speak, her voice wavering as she addressed Mrs. Carter. "Mrs. Carter," she ventured cautiously, maybe it's time we head home. "It's pretty late." Mrs. Carter stopped her pacing abruptly, her gaze snapping to Erin with a startling intensity. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in her silence. "Home," she echoed softly, her voice lilting with a peculiar note. Why, darling, you are home. At least, for tonight. A collective shiver seemed to pass through the group. Helen's skin prickled, her unease rising to a fever pitch. She'd seen her mother behave strangely before, her perfectionist tendencies veering into obsession, but tonight was different. Tonight, her mother wore a face she didn't recognize, a face that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Helen rose from her seat, crossing to her mother with a forced calmness she didn't feel. "Mom," she whispered, trying to catch her eye. "Maybe it's time we ended the party? People need to go home. It's been a long night." But Mrs. Carter's gaze remained fixed on her, her eyes shining with a strange, fevered gleam. "Oh, but you can't end what hasn't finished," she murmured, her tone both gentle and unyielding. "Don't you see, Helen? We've barely begun." Her voice was soft but held an unrelenting firmness, a conviction that made Helen's stomach churn. Mrs. Carter turned back to the room, her hands clasped in front of her with a frightening calm. "Tonight is a special night," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "It's Halloween, the one night when we get to be exactly who we are. Isn't that what we all want? To shed the masks?" She smiled, a slow, eerie smile that seemed to grow wider, and Helen felt something twist inside her. It was a smile that didn't belong to her mother, but to someone, or something else, some stranger who had slipped in, who had made itself comfortable in her mother's skin. "I think it's time," Mrs. Carter said, more to herself than anyone else. She drifted toward the living room door and, with a swift, purposeful movement, clicked the lock. The sound echoed through the silence like a nail being driven into wood, final and unbreakable. Helen's heart pounded in her chest as her friends looked at one another, their expressions pale with confusion and a growing panic. Chris moved quickly to the window, tugging at the frame, but it held firm. Aaron tried the back door, only to find it locked as well. "Mrs. Carter, what are you doing?" Aaron's voice was high, desperate. "This isn't funny. Please, let us out." But Mrs. Carter simply shook her head, a small, knowing smile curving her lips. "Funny," she repeated, as if the idea amused her. "Oh no, darling. Halloween is many things, but it isn't funny." Helen stared at her mother, a strange sense of betrayal blooming in her chest. It was as if her mother had ceased to see them, as though they were merely pieces in a game only she could understand. Desperation clawed at her, and she moved closer, her voice dropping to a trembling whisper. "Mom," she pleaded, "please, whatever this is, just stop." But Mrs. Carter's gaze softened with a strange tenderness, and she reached out to gently touch Helen's cheek. "Oh, Helen," she whispered, her tone almost gentle. "It's time for you to see the world as it truly is." As the room filled with the tense silence of locked doors and drawn curtains, Mrs. Carter stepped back, her hands raised as if in benediction. Her eyes shone with a fevered light, a gleam of something Helen could only describe as hunger. "There's more to the world, my darling," Mrs. Carter murmured, her voice swelling with a strange, awful joy. "There's so much that lies hidden, so much waiting for you, just beyond the veil. And tonight," she gestured to the room, to the shadows that seemed to pulse with their own dark life, "tonight, you'll see it. Tonight, we all will." The room seemed to contract, the air thickening as her words hung heavy, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Helen looked to her friends, their eyes mirroring the terror she felt, their faces pale as they watched her mother with silent dread. And in that moment, Helen understood. Whatever game her mother was playing, whatever dark fascination had taken root in her mind, they were all now a part of it. The night wasn't over, and her mother wouldn't let it end until she'd revealed the darkness she so clearly believed in. As the clock struck the hour, chiming softly through the stillness, Helen felt the walls press in tighter, her heartbeat loud in the quiet. The night was still young, and they were trapped, held fast within her mother's terrifying, unyielding vision. The stillness in the room grew heavy, pressing down on Helen and her friends like a thick, suffocating blanket. The soft crackling of the candles, once warm and inviting, now seemed to underscore the rising tension, each flicker casting elongated shadows that wavered like specters waiting for their moment to close in. Helen could feel her friends' eyes darting to her, silent pleas for guidance or comfort, anything that would anchor them to the reality they'd all known just hours before. But her mother's gaze, intense and unwavering, felt like a wall Helen couldn't break through. The woman standing before her was both familiar and foreign, as though her mother's own reflection had stepped out of the mirror, strange and altered, refusing to go back. "Why don't we play a game?" Mrs. Carter's voice was smooth, coaxing, as if they were children around a campfire, ready to be drawn into the thrill of a ghost story. But her smile held a flicker of something sinister, something Helen hadn't seen before in her mother's gentle expressions. It was a smile that promised an answer to an unasked question, a glimpse into the darkness beyond the veil her mother seemed so eager to show them. Aaron, usually the brave one, took a shaky step forward. "Mrs. Carter," she stammered, her voice brittle, "we really should be going. Our parents, they'll be worried." Mrs. Carter's eyes softened, but the smile remained fixed, unwavering. "Oh, Aaron, what's one night? One little Halloween night away from home?" Her voice slipped into a hushed whisper, as though sharing a secret meant only for Aaron's ears. "Besides, tonight, you're exactly where you need to be." Helen's pulse thudded loudly in her ears, a rising panic that she tried desperately to smother. But when she looked back to her friends, their eyes wide and fixed on her mother, she knew that something deep and unfathomable had changed. There was no warmth left in Mrs. Carter's gaze, only a fevered intensity, as if the boundaries of the world had started to blur, and they'd all stumbled into her dream. Mrs. Carter turned back to the room with a graceful, sweeping motion, her voice steady and controlled. "This house, it's filled with stories, you know. I filled it with everything we could possibly need to make this night perfect." Helen felt herself recoil, the sense of being trapped only growing stronger. Every candle, every carefully placed decoration seemed to watch them with silent, knowing eyes. This wasn't just her mother's party, this was her mother's masterpiece. A carefully crafted illusion that had slipped too far, like a spell that refused to be undone. "Mom, please." Helen's voice was low, her words nearly lost in the oppressive quiet. "Let's just let everyone go home. This has gone far enough." But Mrs. Carter barely acknowledged her, as if Helen's words held no more weight than the rustle of leaves against the windows. Instead, she moved to the center of the room, her eyes unfocused, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Her lips moved in a soft, rhythmic chant, unintelligible, haunting. The friends exchanged uneasy glances, their unease blossoming into outright fear as the chant filled the air, each word more surreal and unsettling than the last. Helen felt her skin prickle, a chill racing down her spine. This was no mere Halloween trick, it was something far more disturbing, a glimpse into her mother's unraveling mind, her obsession finally laid bare for them all to see. Aaron, trembling, turned to Chris, her voice barely a whisper. "This isn't right. We need to get out." Chris nodded, his eyes darting to the locked doors and sealed windows. "We'll find a way," he murmured, a touch of determination in his voice. But even as he said it, Helen could see the doubt shadowing his face. Every exit had been methodically barred, and the weight of her mother's fixation seemed to seep into every corner of the house, locking them in place as effectively as any bolt. Mrs. Carter's chant faded into a chilling silence, and she looked up, her face illuminated by the candlelight. Her gaze swept over each of them, softening when it fell on Helen. "You understand, don't you?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I did all of this for you. For us." The words settled heavily over Helen, an unspoken promise that she couldn't bear to acknowledge. The room seemed to close in around her, the familiar walls now strange and distorted, as if her mother's madness had seeped into the very wood and plaster. Each breath felt labored, every shadow a reminder of the inescapable trap she was caught in. Erin took a step forward, her voice barely holding back the tremor. "Mrs. Carter, please. Just open the door. Let us go." For a moment, Mrs. Carter's gaze flickered with something like regret, a brief, flickering hesitation. But it passed quickly, and her smile returned, serene and unnerving. "But this is Halloween, Erin. One night when the world bends, when what's hidden becomes seen." She reached out, her fingers brushing against the window, her voice dropping to a murmur. "What if, just for tonight, we let the masks fall? We see what lies beneath?" The room fell into an oppressive silence, each of them held enthralled by her words. Helen felt her throat tighten, her fear reaching a breaking point. Her mother had always loved Halloween, but this was something far darker, a fixation that had turned its gaze back on them, trapping them in a nightmare of her own making. With a sudden burst of courage, Helen took a step toward her mother, her voice firm and steady. "Mom," she said, her tone sharp, urgent. "You need to stop this. Now." But Mrs. Carter only laughed, a soft, hollow sound that seemed to echo through the room. "Stop," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with something unnameable. "Oh, Helen, why would we ever want to stop?" In that moment, Helen knew that the woman before her wasn't the mother she'd grown up with. This was someone else, someone driven by a darkness that she couldn't understand, and as her mother's smile widened, Helen felt the weight of that darkness settle over her, binding her to the shadows that had become their prison. And somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed, counting down the moments as the night deepened, each tick a reminder of the hours still left in the unending nightmare that was Mrs. Carter's Halloween. The chime of the clock dissolved into the heavy silence, lingering like the last notes of a melody just out of reach. Helen's heart beat in her throat, her mind racing to grasp at an escape that felt as elusive as the shifting shadows. Her mother's presence filled the room with an unyielding intensity, her expression softened by candlelight but darkened by something that held all of them transfixed, unable to look away. Mrs. Carter slowly turned to face the others, her expression one of serene detachment, as if she were savoring a private revelation. "This house," she began, her voice barely more than a murmur, "has secrets, you know. Secrets we keep hidden until we simply can't." Her eyes fell on each of Helen's friends in turn, studying them, as though she could see through their expressions of discomfort and fear down to something even they didn't know they carried. Chris took a breath, his voice barely breaking the silence. "Mrs. Carter," he started, but she silenced him with a single look, a calm, chilling gesture that turned his words to dust. "You're all here for a reason," she said, her tone almost affectionate, like a mother speaking to misbehaving children. "Tonight is a night when the world reveals itself, piece by piece. Aren't you the least bit curious to see what lies beneath?" Her words held a strange allure, a pull that unsettled Helen. She found herself gripped by a vague, magnetic dread, like she was on the edge of an abyss she couldn't quite see. Her friends shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances, but Helen knew they all felt it too, a strange compulsion to stay, to watch, to understand, even as every part of them wanted to run. Mrs. Carter's smile lingered, a blend of pride and something darker, as she continued. "Do you know why I love Halloween so much?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered, and she let it stretch out, savoring the silence. "It's the one night when we can all wear our true faces. When the masks fall away, and we're free to be what we are without judgment." Helen felt a chill creep along her spine, a crawling sense that her mother was slipping away from her, piece by piece, lost in a world she'd only just begun to understand. "Mom, please, enough," she whispered, though her voice was weak, the words barely audible. She wasn't sure if her mother even heard. But Mrs. Carter's gaze fell upon her, softening for a moment, the faintest trace of affection warming her features. "Oh, Helen," she said, her tone gentle, almost pitying. "You don't see it, do you? This isn't just my night, it's ours. It's for all of us." With a sudden, fluid movement, she reached out and took Helen's hand, squeezing it with an intensity that made Helen wince. Her mother's hand was cold, almost clammy, her grip unyielding. And in her eyes, Helen saw a glimmer of something raw, something that pulsed with a terrible need. "We're meant to be here, all of us," Mrs. Carter continued, her gaze flicking between the friends. "We all have a part to play, if only you're brave enough to see it." The words felt like a dare, a twisted invitation. Aaron looked to Helen, her expression pleading, but there was no easy comfort Helen could offer. She was as trapped, as helpless, as any of them. And for the first time, Helen saw her mother not as the woman she'd grown up with, but as someone altogether other, a person with secrets, with desires, with a purpose she could only guess at. Finally, Chris broke the silence, his voice steady but tinged with fear. "This isn't a game," he said, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. "Whatever you're trying to do, we don't want any part of it." Mrs. Carter's smile wavered, her expression flickering with something unreadable. "A game?" she repeated, almost thoughtfully. "Perhaps it is, Chris. Perhaps we're all just playing a part." With that, she released Helen's hand, turning back to the room, her gaze sweeping over the decorations, the flickering candlelight, the meticulously arranged pumpkins. And then, with a strange, quiet intensity, she spoke, almost to herself. "It's a shame, really, how afraid people are of what they don't understand. Fear of the unknown. Fear of themselves." Her words sent a shiver through Helen, a reminder that her mother's mind had slipped into a place she couldn't follow. She watched as her mother crossed the room, her figure casting long shadows that seemed to reach out, twisting along the walls like grasping fingers. Without warning, Mrs. Carter turned sharply to the group, her smile broadening, her eyes alight with a feverish energy. "Well, then, I suppose there's only one way to satisfy you all." In one swift motion, she moved to the wall, extinguishing one of the main candles, casting the room into near darkness. The sudden dimming of the light heightened every sensation, every whisper and creak seeming magnified, as if the house itself were leaning in, listening. Helen felt her heartbeat quicken, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Around her, her friends clutched each other's arms, their faces pale, wide-eyed in the wavering light. The air grew colder, the silence thick and suffocating, until it felt like the very walls were closing in. And then, from the shadows, Mrs. Carter's voice drifted through the room, soft, gentle, almost playful. "What will you do, Helen, when there's nowhere left to hide?" The question lingered, chilling Helen to her core. The room seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding with each flicker of candlelight. Shadows drifted along the walls, elongating and merging, as if summoned by Mrs. Carter's question. Helen's heart pounded, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken feeling that something was about to happen, something irreversible. She clutched the edges of her costume, grounding herself as best she could, her gaze darting to her friends, whose faces mirrored her unease. Chris, Aaron, and the others stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of confusion and dread, as if they, too, sensed the change in Mrs. Carter, a delicate line she had crossed, slipping into a place beyond their reach. "Mom," Helen whispered, her voice thin and pleading. She barely recognized it as her own. "Please, this is just a party. Let us go." Her words felt as fragile as the candlelight, but they hung in the air, challenging the dark. Mrs. Carter turned slowly, her face shadowed yet unmistakably intent, her eyes glinting with an unearthly excitement that chilled Helen to the core. "A party?" She said the word softly, rolling it over her tongue as if savoring its taste. "Helen, this night isn't about what you think. It's about seeing who we really are, who you are." Helen's stomach clenched, a deep-seated fear taking root. This wasn't her mother, not the woman who had braided her hair for school, or taught her to bake cookies, or listen patiently to her troubles. This was someone else, someone with a fierce, unyielding gaze that seemed to see straight through her. Helen felt a sudden urge to scream, to break the spell, but the words caught in her throat. Chris took a step forward, clearing his throat, his voice breaking the silence. "Mrs. Carter, I think we should really be heading out now. Our parents will be expecting us." But Mrs. Carter's gaze remained fixed on Helen, as though no one else existed. "Helen," she murmured, reaching out a hand. "Do you remember the stories I used to tell you when you were little? The ones about Halloween nights long ago? I told you that they weren't just stories, they were truths, dressed up for the children." Helen felt a rush of memory, a dim recollection of late nights spent by the fire, her mother weaving strange tales of ancient rituals, of figures and masks that moved through the dark. At the time, she had dismissed them as fables, the remnants of her mother's eccentric imagination. But now, under her mother's unblinking stare, the weight of those words felt disturbingly real. The air grew colder still, the silence pressing down like a hand on her shoulder. Helen took a step back, instinctively distancing herself from the woman she could barely recognize. Her friends looked on, bewildered, their eyes pleading for some reassurance, some answer that would make this all a misunderstanding. Mrs. Carter gave a quiet, almost wistful laugh, the sound thin and brittle. "You always wanted to know the truth, Helen. Always asking questions. I suppose tonight, you'll finally understand." Without warning, she reached up and extinguished the final candle, plunging the room into darkness. The sudden loss of light seemed to pull the breath from Helen's lungs. She heard the soft gasp of her friends, the shuffling of feet, but her gaze remained fixed in the direction of her mother, straining to see through the shadows. In the silence, Helen felt something shift, a sensation that went beyond sound, something she couldn't quite name. It was as though the very walls of the house had drawn in, surrounding them, pressing close, as if they too were part of Mrs. Carter's strange game. Helen's mind raced, grappling with an instinctive need to flee, but the heavy darkness held her in place. Then, her mother's voice cut through the silence, soft but piercing. "The door's open, Helen. You may leave if you wish, but you must choose." The words hung in the air, filling Helen with a mixture of dread and strange, inexplicable hope. Her mother had always spoken of choices, of decisions that marked one's path forever. But Helen felt a compulsion, stronger than fear, to defy whatever this night held. Her heart raced as she turned to the dim outline of the front door, the exit barely visible in the faint moonlight seeping through the windows. Helen glanced back at her friends, nodding for them to follow, and they scrambled toward the door, moving through the dark like shadows fleeing a nightmare. As her fingers found the cool brass of the doorknob, she felt her mother's gaze, almost tangible in its intensity, watching her from the blackness. "You can go, Helen," Mrs. Carter's voice echoed. "But remember, some doors, once opened, can never truly close." With a trembling hand, Helen turned the knob, pushing the door open, and cold night air rushed in, filling the room with a gust that felt like freedom and finality. She and her friends stumbled out onto the porch, breathless, each of them casting a final, haunted look back at the house. Standing in the doorway, framed by the shadowed interior, Mrs. Carter watched them with a calm, unreadable expression, her figure still, almost statuesque. Her face softened as she looked at Helen, and for a fleeting moment, Helen saw the woman she'd known, the mother who had held her close in the dark, comforting her with gentle whispers. "Happy Halloween, Helen," Mrs. Carter said, her voice carrying across the threshold, a whisper lost to the night. Helen felt a strange ache, a sense of loss she couldn't fully grasp, as she turned away, stepping into the night with her friends by her side. The chill of autumn air cut through her, a reminder that they were free, that they had escaped whatever strange fate lingered in the house. But as they walked down the street, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, a shadow stretching just beyond her reach, a reminder of the night's strange, unspoken truth. And though they would talk about it later, Chris, Aaron, and the others, trying to make sense of Mrs. Carter's words, her actions, her obsessions, Helen knew that whatever she had glimpsed in the darkness of that house was a part of her now, an unsettling secret, buried in her heart. And as she looked back one last time, the house loomed in the distance, silent and watchful, its windows glowing faintly in the moonlight, like eyes that had seen something she would never quite understand. In the days that followed, the memory of that night lingered, faint yet persistent, like the echo of her mother's words, haunting her dreams. The end.